But I'd like to introduce tonight's speaker. This is Eric Iseman, and I think probably, how many of you have been to one of his programs or seen him at Smith Rock? Yeah, right. Wow. You've got quite a following.
I suppose so.
Well, Eric has lived on the ranch since 1997. Got that right. And he retired after 20 years of service with the Oregon State Parks. And I think we have somebody else here with state parks, or was. Are you retired now?
Yeah, after 35 years.
Whoa! Whoa, that's excellent.
Test of human endurance.
So, and instead of trying to give an overview of Eric's program, because it's pretty sophisticated, I'm going to let Eric tell you all about it. And after the program, don't forget to come up and take a look at, Eric's got some books here that you can kind of thumb through, and we've got our field guides available for sale after the program. And if you like tonight's program and you'd like to make a donation to help us keep these programs going, that would be super great, because we pay for the room and we pay a speaker's fee. So thank you. You're on. I'll turn off the light.
Well, first off, I do want to thank the fans group for all of their local preservation efforts and this very educational lens on learning series that's held usually each month. And I know I've personally learned quite a bit by attending these talks. Some of them are on geology, native plants, birds, and the like. I've done some on the local history. This is a particular topic that I have a lot of interest in. And my first picture here, I wanted to put up for people to peruse. I saw that Paul was looking at it closely, because this is about what we had in the way of glacial maximum ice approximately 20,000 years ago. And much of the ocean water was locked up in ice, and the ocean levels were 300 to 400 feet lower than they are today when we're near the glacial minimum. And certain areas like the West Coast, there's not much change on the coastline, but places like Yucatan or Florida are quite a bit wider. Over here you can notice that Siberia and Alaska are linked together land-wise, because these are very shallow waters. Japan linked back to Asia on the north and south end. And here's where there's quite a bit of difference between then and now, where you would have this connection with Australia, and I believe this is Borneo. It was called Sudan-land in those days. And another very interesting area in those days, about 20,000 years ago, the British Isles were linked up to France and Holland, albeit under the ice. Here's a view of what North America was thought to be like. Of course, there was ice up there, but we're connected to Siberia, we're connected to Greenland at that time. Here's what it was like at the glacial maximum on the left, where you have at sea level, about from what's now New York to about what's now Chicago and all the way over to Olympia, roughly at sea level, ice extended down that far. About 10,000 years ago, after most of the events that I'm going to share with you, this area was the corridor that archaeologists would say a lot of migration came over from Siberia and down through here and entered on the east side of the Rocky Mountains. And this is more like what we have here today. These are the areas that are currently holding ice. So you can see there's quite a bit of changes. This fella, I want to credit J. Harlan Bretz. He was the first person who put forth these ideas that I will share with you, that different than in most cases where there are ice ages ending that are so gradual, that these ice ages last 20,000 years, and it's almost imperceptible how they're ending. He maintained that he saw evidence of a massive flood at the end of the last glacial maximum. And he put forth these ideas exactly 100 years ago in 1923. He ran into stiff opposition. The general belief in the scientific community was that there was these gradual processes, which are usually the case. Things are evolving gradually. In the case of an ice age beginning, there's more snow falling in the winter than can melt the following summer. At the end of the ice age, there's more snow melting in the summer than falls the following winter. It might be a 1,000-year process. But he saw signs that it was a much bigger thing. And so his quote here is, Harlan Bretz, who patiently taught us that catastrophic floods may sometimes play a role in nature's unfolding drama. He ran into this scientific community that disavowed his premises of this big flood, and he was pitted against the gradualists, and his ideas were thought to be catastrophism, if I pronounced it right. He was studying the interesting geology of primarily the Columbia Plateau, and there were these successive lava flows kind of coming out of the common border with Idaho here and flowing probably to the west. And these are, if this would be the oldest one, the next one was about this size, massive one here. These are thought to be 15 or more million years ago. And we're very close to the southern edge of this. As you go out of Madras and north, you hit that plateau. And these would have flowed liquid across the land in a week or two before they cooled, totally transforming it time and time again. His work took him over to the channeled scablands, as they're called, which was those lava flows one upon another. And he was startled to see that there's large sections of the lava totally exposed by what he presumed to be the floods. All the topsoil washed away, and this is what they would be referring to as the scablands. He saw these kind of inexplicable series of rhythmites in several locations, up in the Hanford Reach and more along the Walla Walla River. And over by Missoula, Montana, he saw some lines that indicated that at one time there was water up here very high to this level here. There was so much water in the Missoula area. You can see the size of houses, for example, and this is just a very, very small section of what was the Lake Missoula. It was about the size of Lake Erie in the Great Lakes. And there was the summit of the Rockies were about here, and that was a lobe of the ice sheet coming down. And it was effectively a dam. So all the slow melting that normally happens at the end of the ice age was pooling up here in what's called Lake Missoula. Something happened to that ice dam, and it broke free at some point in time, and the water all flowed out and out to the sea. It also totally flowed down the entire Willamette Valley, but it didn't flow into the Deschutes at all. It kind of shot past the Deschutes. There were several constrictions here and there that allowed big temporary lakes. This flood was thought to have happened in approximately 2 weeks. Now, there were other floods. There were other floods in the process of the glaciers breaking down at the end of the Ice Age, but this one in particular is known to be the biggest flood ever known, worldwide. And we'll see that this is just one channel of it. This is an artist's depiction. It's actually using the mountains, an actual photo of the mountains, to demonstrate this ice dam that held back these many miles of glacial meltwater. And at some point in time, it collapsed, sending all this water draining to the west and giant icebergs along with it. So they were looking for how this would happen. It didn't seem like this was a slow process. This was a sudden process. And in time, there came this hypothesis of how this happened. Now, I've got a picture here. I find this really intriguing because we would pass through the Taurid meteor swarm twice a year. Here's the Earth rotating around the sun, and here's this Taurid swarm of different densities. And it's moving, we're moving. We encounter it twice a year. I believe it's happening now, and it happens again in October. At times, we pass through some very dense areas of this, and this was like a woodcut from, I believe, the 1840s in Europe, where they maintained there were hundreds of shooting stars an hour. And they're trying to depict that. So there came up the comet impact hypothesis of impact that caused the end of the Ice Age and other things that we'll show you. This is a pictograph that's in Deschutes County that was identified by Wilson Weewa, who some of you know. He's the keeper of the oral history of the tribe. And he maintains this is an image of a comet. It's quite a large image. It's nearly 3 feet large. And there's this other image above it that I want to draw your attention to. You have almost like a head of a comet here, a lot like what a comet appears like, the yellowish front. You have the very rare use of yellow pigment that I've only seen a handful of times out of visiting several sites. So there's great effort to put into this, and it's the highest image on a very busy rock art panel. Here's a close-up of it. Here's another depiction of a comet. This one is in Tulare County, California. And there too, there is this zigzaggy line, much like the stuff over at Deschutes County. Here's another depiction of a comet. Once again, some yellow pigment. And this is from Chaco Canyon, New Mexico. This is a very large depiction of a comet at one of the main archaeoastronomy sites known in North America. And this is a little enhanced since the tail is quite faint now, but once again we've got the use of yellow paint at the head of the comet. So in the oral history of the tribes, there is this story that a comet created great havoc, and the one in Deschutes County reputedly is one of the only places that the native people still come to annually and give offerings and ceremony and pray that something like this never happens again. So after I heard about the comet from the native people in the year 2007, this particular scientific paper was launched. And I'll read it in brief. It says, a carbon-rich black layer dating to about 12,500 years ago has been identified at Clovis age sites, 50 Clovis age sites across North America. And it appears contemporaneous with the abrupt onset of younger Dryas cooling, which I will define that in a minute. There were tool assemblages, Clovis tool assemblages below a black layer, and not in it nor above it, and this is very important. Causes for the extinctions, the white D cooling, and termination of the Clovis culture have long been controversial. I remember being in school and we were taught that the Mega Fauna were hunted to extinction. That may be partially true. The 50 sites across North America, at the time of 2007, here they are. So not all archaeological sites are that far back in time. You know, they might bottom out at 3,000 years. For those few sites where they went back 12,000 years, they consistently found what's called the black mat. And there it is very distinctly. It's a very thin layer. And this is at also what they call the YDB, the Younger Dryas Boundary. And what that is a distinct carbon datable at 12,800 years, indications of a super fire. This isn't just a campfire. The very high temperature impact melt products as evidence of cosmic air bursts and impacts is thought to, the compounds that are in that black mat are thought to be only produced by high impact shock and an estimated over 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit. So, some of this information is, especially some of the dates, are derived from ice cores. Some of the dates are derived from marine sediments, lake sediments, even coral can be used to indicate certain events above ground. In the black mat are these impact sphericals magnified thousands of times. You wouldn't even see them if it was on your finger. They're so small. But they are only produced by these huge, powerful, high heat impacts.
What's their composition?
Carbon. Now, they have these, also in that layer are these nano diamonds, also very microscopic. They occur all across the world, but in the carbon mat they're about 100 times more prevalent than out in other locations. There's also anomalies with platinum, iridium, and a couple other things that are known to form in space. Now, this comet's not to be confused with the comet that was much older that is reputed to have wiped out the dinosaurs. That was millions of years before, and it was probably a bigger event. High heat shock impact nanodiamonds and magnetic spherules in black mats. More and more scientific peer-reviewed documentation coming in since the original report went out in 2007. We've got information from South America. We've got stuff in Colombia and Peru and Patagonia, Chile. We've got the black mat in Syria. We've got it in Russia and Holland, Turkey. Here's some of the extent of this YDB field worldwide in the northern hemisphere especially, but some finds in the southern, not as many. So ice cores are taken in some cases where the ice is really thick. They go back as much as 800,000 years. But it's common that they can find ice that goes back 100,000 years. And they're too almost like tree rings. There's things indicated that happened at that point in time, and it can be high concentrations of iridium, for example. It could be a lot of carbon. It could be pollen from certain plants. So there is a record there, and you can see this is just one repository here. Now, the Younger Dryas, I wondered for the longest time, what's the younger, what's the older Dryas? What is Dryas? Dryas is a plant here that grows primarily kind of Arctic locations, real cold temperatures. There's a high incidence of pollen of this in the ice cores, and through various methods, of which there's several, they have determined a sudden drop in temperatures that lasted approximately 1,000 years a little over 1,000 years, and is indicated by a high incidence of pollen, and this was the primary plant at this time. It resulted in at least 15 degrees drop in temperature at the equator, and probably more in the northern climates. There was also a sudden rise in sea levels, and this graph on the right shows that. Here is an indication on the left of about the gradual rate we're experiencing nowadays of sea level rise. Maybe in 20 years it's several feet. In some cases, it's believed that the sea level rose over 200 feet. I've heard 350 many times in weeks because of the sudden melting of the ice sheet behind a comet strike. Okay, so the comet, which is being proven as indications of it in the black mat, the superheat of it, probably struck the ice sheet and was approximately, they believe, a mile and a half across. And this is going back to that swarm where there's a number of these meteorites, comet fragments coming in, the fracturing, the zigzaggy lines in the pictograph probably. And these are air bursting in the atmosphere. They feel like there is at least one main strike, and they're able to kind of coordinate this based on a zillion of what they call bays, and there's thousands of them. On the East Coast, they're known primarily as the Carolina Bays. Until recently, they didn't have an explanation. Geologists didn't have an explanation of how these formed. They aren't a bay like you think of with water. Over in Nebraska, they have similar things. At the time that they made this graph, they didn't include the semicircle actually going down into Texas and up into Minnesota, where they've made similar finds. And they believe this is either fragments of the main comet coming in, or more likely when the main area is hit somewhere up here around the Great Lakes. I think they call it Saginaw Bay, stretching all the way up to Hudson Bay, like an angle like this. They can kind of pinpoint the direction of it. And as this would be hitting the ice sheet, bear in mind this was all ice at the time, the main comet hit, or comets, several of them perhaps, hit up there and instantaneously vaporized the comet and much of the ice sheet. And as chunks of ice, they say probably as big as football stadiums, flew out in all directions, kind of like a butterfly-like fan, they landed out here and made these big indentions. We'll take a look at that in a second, but they're very common. And certain fragments are bursting over the woodlands of the forested areas below the ice sheet. Here's some pictures of some of the bays in Carolina. Another view of them. And they're kind of elliptical, and they point, and so they can draw those lines kind of pointing and come up with that idea of where this probably hit. So the sudden melting came down across the continent. It also happened somewhat in Europe. And one of the first places we'll look at here is down Hudson Bay. And there was a big amount of material that came down from the ice sheet here and formed a lot of what is now New Jersey as it came out. This would have been under the ocean in those days. Here is a big amount of the flood directions from above the Great Lakes. And so you have that stuff coming down through New York State. You have stuff going directly out to the Atlantic through Hudson Bay and out St. Lawrence Way. You have some going up the Mackenzie River north towards the Arctic, and you have a lot of it going into the Great Lakes, but also flooding down through what's now Wisconsin and Minnesota. All the main rivers there are avenues of this flood water, and it's joining the Mississippi. From the Mississippi is this huge area of deposits that are thought to be from this cataclysmic flood. Some of the very first references to this would have been from this 1975 work by the University of Miami, and they were right on it. Oxygen isotopes, radiocarbon analysis of deep sea cores from northeastern Gulf of Mexico identify an episode of rapid ice melt, sea level rise at about 9600 BC. Age coincides with the age assigned by Plato to the Great Flood, and I'll go into that a little bit later. So as we work our way west from the bays, on this continent, this is thought to be the largest glacial erratic in the entire world. It's sitting out on the prairies in Alberta, Canada, and it was one piece at one time, and they believe it was not carried at the front of a glacier moving slowly, which is a thing. That the sudden melting of the ice sheet behind the comet strike was taking large chunks of rock and what they call rafting them until these chunks of ice finally grounded, the water level went down, and the rock dropped out. This particular boulder is covered with Native American pictographs, so it's a very important place to the natives. I wouldn't be able to discern what their story is, but I can tell you this is a very busy panel with many figures, much of them faded now. And this almost, to me, would look like the boulder itself moving along a course. That's just an interpretation I get from the figures. So that's located over here in Alberta on the east side of the Rockies. What's also known as the floodwaters are coming down the Fraser River and coming out to what's now Vancouver. So it's a big arm, just one arm, mind you, of that flood coming down the Fraser River, depositing massive boulder fields, creating big sediments deposits. It's probably 30 feet high at least, on top of previous deposits. And here's a map of what they think that Fraser Delta was like back in the day, and then as the floodwaters came down and built it out many miles to where present-day Vancouver is. All built on the flood, apparently. Now going to our local area, this is the Lake Missoula. This is where the big dam was. And when it finally broke free, and we believe, many of us believe, that this is because of the comet strike, suddenly doing something that would have been gradual and more over thousands of years. Suddenly all this water is coming down, but it's not just Missoula water. It's water from the glaciers itself that are coming out to sea level at Olympia. And these floods are coming down in different channels, and these channels are, give the name the channeled scablands. These channels here are, in a way, they're kind of braided together. They kind of come together and they flow out in different ways. And these would be coulees that I'll show you some other pictures of. All this water, however much it was, if it's Lake Missoula, I think Brett himself knew that that alone couldn't explain just what he was seeing in Washington. It was more water than that. But he was happy to just have people accept that it was Missoula flood, very, very rapid. When the water came through Spokane, it was thought to be in excess of 1,000 feet high. And then as it spread out, you know, it got lower, but still hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of feet high, traveling at 60, 70 miles an hour. It hit a constriction right here at Wallula Gap, right about the state line. And it started backing up, and it made this massive lake. There was formerly just channels, but in a day or two, all of a sudden it becomes this massive lake. It runs up the Yakima River Valley all the way to what's now Yakima. And part of what Weewa was telling us about the oral tradition of the comet is he says, my people remember that the Snake River ran backwards. As this constriction held back the water and it flowed all the way back to what's now almost Lewiston, Idaho, for a number of days. Finally, enough water came through. It hit another constriction right here and made this massive lake in this area here, kind of Umatilla way. And I think it did it over here as well. You can see the flood didn't come down into the John Day or the Deschutes, but it flooded the entire Willamette Valley. Now here's some of the evidence that you can find. This is what's called flood ripples. This is up in Montana. And this is a lot like what you would see if you're at the beach or you swim a little bit underwater with scuba gear. You'd see these ripples, which are, on the ocean, an inch or two high. These are 30 to 50 feet high, and they run for miles across large landscapes. A lot of this is hard to see until you actually it's hard to see until you actually can get up in a plane. And I think Brett's was one of the first people to grasp it because he did take a few flights and he got the overview. If you're just on the ground, you don't see over to see the next one like this. But and especially as I was building this program, I was delighted to see so much drone photography that allows you this overview, even maybe better than a plane. So this is thought to be the largest waterfall ever in the history of the world. This is an area that's now known as Dry Falls. This is just one arm of the flood coming down one of the channels, and the ice sheet's still in this area in the west intact, starting to melt pretty quickly. But a lot of water is coming down from at least Lake Missoula and the Okanagan Lobe, and it's creating this channel that we now know as Grand Coulee. Grand Coulee is about 50 miles long, and the narrowest is nearly a mile across. This is what Dry Falls looks like now, and the top of this here, as far as you can see, would have been a waterfall of over 3 miles long. Now this is called a receding cataract. So back in the day, the surface was stretched all the way across here. But there was a little drop and it started eating away the rock, and the waterfall kind of kept moving back, receding as the water poured over. It's thought that it ran for at least 2 weeks. Now here's a really good animation that was done of this using the current lay of the land, but they animated the wave. It was stretching over here, as I say, over 3 miles. Hundreds of feet deep, one of the channels. Here's the Dry Falls again. Aerial view, and this is all scabland of the flood. Notice also we have these circular features here. We'll look more at those. They're considered to be turbulent, swirling eddies of water. The land would have just stretched across here at one time, but this was all eaten away in a very short period of time. Here's another view from the top of the Dry Falls, looking now down the coulee. And this is a state highway. I get to often drive and see this firsthand. And I want to draw your attention to this level right here. Now shown looking back up towards the falls. And you can see quite a bit above the state highway. This is all flood deposits at least 500 feet above the existing floor of this. To give you an idea, this is all material carried in from like the Rocky Mountains. Here's some more of the flood ripples. This is a little further down the Columbia, not too far from Wenatchee. Vast area. Called West Bar. Now here, West Bar's up here. This is one of the coulees. I believe this one's called Potholes Coulee. And if the flood had continued for another week, say, this whole section would have been washed away. As it was, this remains as kind of a narrow channel, narrow ridge between the two coulees. The flood effects, especially up towards Spokane, are what they call basin and butte. So you have these etched areas of water and these flat top buttes sticking out quite commonly. You have the 50-foot deep sinkholes all over the place from the swirling waters. Here's some here. Here's a close-up. The thing that I find beautiful up there near Spokane is thousands of these bedrock lakes. All the soil scoured out. These aren't fed by rivers or creeks, the groundwater or snowmelt. They're all over. This is a type of pothole known as the dike ringed potholes. These are near Odessa. There's lots of those. This would be the reference to the dike. Really beautiful. Pretty good size. There's a farm, for example, by comparison. We've got tens of thousands of iceberg rafted massive erratics carried down by the flood waters. And so this is an artist's depiction of, you know, some of these rocks that would have originated, say, in Canada or the Rocky Mountains, being rafted down to their destinations downriver. You would find these inexplicable piles of these giant boulders all throughout Washington. There's thousands and thousands and thousands of these. These are all thought to be brought in by the massive flood. Columbia River here. Here's one of my favorites. I've been to this one here. It's on a little pedestal. Once again, glacial erratic or flood erratic. This is at Mattawa, a narrow gap in the Columbia River. All of a sudden, things spewed out and just flared out all over that area. Thousands of these boulders. Some are massive. All erratics from the flood. Of course, you have some smaller deposits. So you have, you know, very fine material in some locations. You got, you know, fist-sized rocks. So the definition of a coulee, I was never really clear on this until I started viewing this land. It's not necessarily caused by rivers. In some cases, there's bodies of water there primarily by modern irrigation and dams and holding water. This is more consistent with what a coulee is. They're square-sided, vertical, hundreds of feet high, with a generally flat bottom and no running water. No river creating this. It was a flood. And they're all over the place. See, how again do I lower the screen on this? Lower the image on the screen. I think we're a little high there. Thanks. Take a little back down. There we go. Uh-oh. Got something saying keystone here. I don't know what that's about. Is that what you're doing? Cause that? Okay, thanks. Appreciate it. This is the Upper Grand Coulee, and most of you have probably heard of Grand Coulee Dam. They made a big project there where not only do they back the water up of the Columbia River up into what's called Roosevelt Reservoir for over 100 miles. It goes upriver, but they have these massive pumps, giant, big tunnels where they pump water up from the level of the existing Columbia River, and they fill the coulee, the Grand Coulee, with water. It's a recreation site, and it's dammed on the low end. This is what's called Steamboat Rock, and in this case, the geologists figure that this was all continuous all the way across here, and all this material was washed out in a matter of weeks. It was over the top of the Steamboat Rock. This is also another area where pictographs can be found. Every once in a while there's seasonal waterfalls coming in this time of year from snowmelt up on the top. It's beautiful. Another view of the Upper Grand Coulee. And this is the Lower Grand Coulee, below the dry falls. This is known as Moses Coulee. Lower side of Moses Coulee. You see the scablands here. The water was totally over this level here. Now, they got agricultural activity now, but this is not from rivers or creeks. They would bring in groundwater for this. It's known as Frenchman's Coulee. Columbia River being right over here, the current flow of it. This is pothole coulee. It's like two coulees with a narrow ridge in between that would have been washed away at the rate things were going in a number of more days. But there's several of these side-by-side channels up there, of which this is one. Now, this is the Columbia River down below here, and this is a huge spillway of what they call the ancient lakes. So once again, this is totally scoured of the loess topsoil, and water is being captured in these low basins, and then the whole thing dropped over the side and into the Columbia River. This is not too far from West Bar. There's probably a few of the potholes right in through here. And this is near Odessa, Washington, and this was an area, obviously, of the basalt columns. And they feel like most of these were stripped away by the flood, and just they were already fractured, and it was really easy to take them away like toothpicks in sand. And speaking of sand, a very big deposit of it behind the flood at what's called Hanford Reach, not too far from Hanford. Now here's an interesting area. The lower part of the flood, this was all flooded, and you can see very distinctly scablands from above. There's no soil left here to really do much agriculture. This is the former route of the Palouse River that joined the Columbia. When the flood came down here, it etched very deeply, and it brimmed over a ridge that had kept the flow going like this. It totally veered over and went down this corridor and joined the Snake River, is how it goes now. This is just a creek nowadays. Formerly the river went that way. Oh. So there's another coulee that was caused by this flood, and there's the Palouse Falls, all caused by the flood. Magnificent place, by the way, worth seeing. It's kind of out of the way, but it's amazing. Okay, so that's kind of in here. We've talked about the Snake River backing up towards Lewiston. All the water's coming down, joining together. One flow comes first, and another one comes next, and they all join together around Pasco and Kennewick. But then they hit Wallula Gap. This constriction here allows this backing up, and it becomes a big lake up to Moses Lake, if you know where that is. Much to the north, I'm guessing 75 miles or so. Huge lake, lasts a few days. Little by little, water keeps going down. Here's flood ripples on the Snake from either going up it or coming back down it later. More of the flood ripples and sand deposits, and many of these now are used by the highway department. Sand and gravel outfits, are mining these, because it's all fine grain granite. Massive deposit on the Snake River. This is Wallula. This is known as the Twin Sisters, and there too, the floodwaters, had they gone another few days, would have washed this all away. This was very high ridges compared to what the floods had come through, and so they didn't top over those. The water backed up. Here's a view looking across from the Washington side to the Twin Sisters, and more importantly, beyond that, this big Lake Lewis, flat area that was formerly flooded way back beyond the horizon. Wallula Gap. That's what the artists believe it kind of looked like when it was coursing through with the big Lake Lewis in the background. There is a super major petroglyph that was formerly at Wallula Gap. It's known as the monolith, and it's very busy. There's a lot of activity here. I wouldn't be able to decipher. I would not be able to tell you this is about the flood, but this is some big story. And I would reckon that these forms here are possibly depictions of the Columbia River, the flow. It looks kind of like what you might think of as a flow. This was moved by the railroad in about 1900, and they just loaded it on a flat cart, many tons, and they moved it to Portland to the city hall. It's over 6 feet high here, many tons. And in time, the Umatilla were able to get it repatriated, and it is now in front of the Umatilla tribal headquarters, its current location, which is closer to its original location at Wallula. As we move down the Columbia, we're looking now across from Rowena Heights, and I think this is what, the Klickitat River coming in here, and very distinctly flood levels indicated here. So by the time the water got down this far, it had gone from the 1,000 feet in Spokane, but it's still 600-700 feet high. And there it is. This is an artist's depiction. This would be Crown Point, looking up the river, Beacon Rock, and this wall of water coming down. The wall came down, and this is current day Portland, with the West Hills of Portland over here. And this is some high country that stayed above the flood. And this is an artist's depiction of the floodwaters at approximately 400 feet high on the current skyline of downtown, all the way across towards Washington there. Flood erratics were rafted down the Willamette Valley, and this one's outside of McMinnville. Here's an artist's depiction of the same rock, and this is how it appears. The Willamette Valley, you know, is thought to be one of the most fertile places in the world. And it was a big draw for the pioneers coming out on the Oregon Trail because there was the promise of loam that was 60 feet deep. Well, that's deposits from the flood. It's all this granite dust and all this material that washed all the way down in here and made the Willamette Valley much what it is as a major agricultural site. Glacial erratic. Now, near Oregon City and West Lynn, this Willamette meteorite, largest ever found in North America, 6th largest intact meteorite in the entire world, was found. And here's an old picture of a fellow standing by it. This is thought to have been brought down like the other erratics in the flood, probably on an iceberg, deposited there in West Lynn. And later, it was sold to, I think, the Museum of Natural History in New York, where it currently resides. Oregon's tried to get it back. The tribes tried to get it back. And they made an arrangement with the museum to keep it there as long as it's on public display. They're okay. And as long as they can come in private, the Umatilla traditional people will go there once a year to have ceremony around it. It was a venerated rock by the tribe when it was in Oregon. Well, some of you might have come from Corvallis, and you might have heard that formerly Research Stadium now it's another name, but the football stadium is being revamped. And when they were working on the goalposts in 2016 and excavating to put new goalposts in, they came across mammoth bones right at the goalposts of all things. It should be the Oregon State mammoths instead of the beavers, maybe. But this was also found in a creek that was being eroded in Tualatin, and this is set back up at, I think, their city hall. And there was also finds of mammoths made at Woodburn at the high school, and they were all in sediments that date also to the flood. We put this date on this big flood. And subsequently in Corvallis, I think it was in 2020, on 9th Street, if you're familiar with it, they were doing some sidewalk work, and they came up with more mammoth tusks. Whether it was from the same one or not, I don't know, not too far away. But these Mega Fauna were there in those days. Now, getting back to the black mat, very consistent black line, only an inch or two thick. So there's significant artifact assemblages above and below the black mat. So we would say this is carbon datable to, we'll just say 13,000 years ago. As they dig below the black mat, they find consistently megafauna bones. And these 50 sites or more now worldwide. Megafauna bones, culturally modified megafauna bones, and the big Clovis, as the Clovis culture, the big spear points used by the Clovis culture to hunt the megafauna. Below, none above. So this builds the theory that this was so major and destabilizing an event that the megafauna did go extinct behind the event. We know that there were people contemporary with the megafauna, and primarily the mammoths. There's all sorts of hunt sites. They had the big spears to get these things, and it would take half the tribe to get one down. But then they'd feed the whole tribe for a while, you know. This is a spear point, one of many in a cache that was found near Wenatchee. They have a find that they have carbon dated to before the flood at Sequoia, Washington, and they found a embedded spear in a back rib or back bone, perhaps, of a mammoth. Also, indication that people were here at the same time that the mammoths. These are Clovis sites in Washington, the one in Sequoia is somewhere up in here, and Wenatchee finds, and a few others here. Most of this was washed away in the flood. There's many more finds of Clovis artifacts. Each one of these red dots is thought to be a find of that era. These megafauna had lived for 4 or 5 million years until this point in time. The 30 biggest species, the big sloths, my favorite, but there were giant armadillos and saber-toothed tigers, and there were giant bears, fierce animals. They all disappeared about that time. There might have been isolated groups here and there. Those were hunted and finally all killed off. But it was the comet and the flood that did away their habitat. Imagine these fires happening in the woodlands, say Ohio or Kentucky, where these things were roaming, or Corvallis or what have you. These fires consumed 10% of the biomass of the planet. That is estimated to be a minimum of 5 million square miles burnt. So they lost habitat in a big way. Here's some information about the sea level rise, thought to be sudden at times. This is the more typical rise of the ocean when there's a slow melting of the ice sheet. And in the course of, modern humans over the last 200,000 years, there's been a couple ice ages. We survive these things, we adapt, we're resourceful and such. But this happened pretty suddenly as it goes. That's a sea level rise. Divers were investigating a rock alignment in Lake Michigan. It was kind of a long line of boulders that flared at the end into a circle. It was thought to be above water so many thousands of years ago. And they happened to find, in association with that, a mastodon or Columbia mammoth petroglyph. It's now under 30, 40 feet of water. Now, our first picture was the coastlines as they were back in this time of the glacial maximum, where the sea level was 350, 400 feet below. What that map didn't show is off to the side is what is the Azore Islands in the Atlantic, many more islands above water, not by far, but there's this whole body of land that's above that ocean level at that time. Here's our coast, there's Florida, how wide it was in those days. Of course, this is the existing coastline now. Much of the Caribbean was kind of connected, Bahamas and such, coming out of Venezuela, big old chunks of land above water. This is all submerged.
18,000 years ago.
Now here's a story, this is less verifiable than what I've shared with you, but it's important to consider. Story of Atlantis related by Solon, who was, I believe, uncle to Plato, who's writing it down. Solon is in Egypt, and he is talking to the keepers of the history of Egypt. And they're telling him that before Egypt, there was Atlantis. This comes from ancient Egypt, from their history. And as advanced as Egypt was, with their megalithic structures and a peaceful society for thousands of years, the pyramids, you know, they were saying that they are only the remnants of what was before them. And when asked when that time was, he's operating at about 600 BC. They're telling him it's 9,600 years ago. So when you do the math, this is putting it pretty much in the time frame of what we know scientifically were massive floods. So it alludes to Atlantis, it alludes to Mu, that's over there in Indonesia, and worldwide there's 200 cultural flood myths. You know, each of the tribes in North America has a flood myth. We're just talking about the one that the Northern Paiutes know. There's a lot more details to Atlantis from the Egyptians than we hear about. And if you start looking into the details, they tell you the size of the capital city and how it was laid out. So this is, of course, a modern artist's depiction based on what the Egyptians have. The Egyptians are telling you that there was this place. So, be it back then or more recently, things were, those ancient cultures were way more maritime than we give them credit. So here is a representation based on the biblical measurements of the Ark. Now there's complete replicas, life-size replicas of this in like Kentucky and Holland. I almost included pictures of this in the modern day. It's much like this. This is maybe 500 feet. Notice there's no windows. And this is just drifting. But we know there were crafts like this that the Egyptians, Phoenicians had that were ocean-worthy. We also know that a lot of the migrations to the Americas from Siberia were not just overland through that ice-free corridor that we talked about earlier. It was maritime along the coast. And we also know that the dates coming in from South America now are older than anything in North America yet. So they used to tell you, oh, well, they came down through the corridor and went down all the way to South America, and that was later than the stuff up north. Well, they're finding the opposite is true. These dates coming in from South America are very old. Not that we won't find something like that, but we haven't yet. So that would imply that maritime people came across the vastness of the Pacific Ocean from places like Australia. And there's some genetic work, DNA work, that's showing those links to Australia. They didn't come through Siberia and down through North America. They were way more maritime than we give them credit. Now they talk about Atlantis being an advanced civilization, and that doesn't necessarily mean advanced at our level. It's advanced to most of the cultures that were happening there that were hunter-gatherers, like here in North America. It was advanced. It was likely building with monolithic stones. It was doing agriculture. It's a myth. We can't prove it. But here's some interesting stuff. The Younger Dryas, it's verifiable, is right in that time frame. The Younger Dryas, the cold period that lasts for 1,000 years. So imagine this comet is hit. It's started fires, it's melted all this water, the sea level rises, but what that's doing is it's putting very cold water from the ice melting into the oceans and disrupting the currents that are bringing warm water to, say, England and Europe. you've got the ocean temperature dropping by an estimated 5 degrees. Doesn't seem like much, but it's enough to change the currents. And that lasted for over 1,000 years. You've got all these particles up in the air from the comet strikes that are blocking out full sunlight reaching the Earth. And there's so much material up there for so long, and it takes so long for the ocean levels to warm up again. 1,000 years goes by. All of our modern cultures are way past that younger Dryas. It's in the more warmer era that we are currently in. So you see your things like the Indus Valley or Chinese is all happening much after the event. Where there's smoke, there's fire, is the old saying. And there is this myth. There was an ancient civilization. So kind of in conclusion here, what you first would have maybe heard of as the Brett's Flood, later Missoula Flood, Spokane Flood, Ice Age Flood, biblical Noah's Flood, are probably all the same thing from that point in time. Case in point, this is a cave that was found by divers. It's currently 100 some feet under the existing ocean level in France. Divers were coming along here. This is all limestone and very intriguing coastline. They find this tunnel. They start going up it. They pop out above sea level into a chamber that has thousands of year-old paintings.
Is that Lascaux?
No. Look at this place. That's ocean water. Now, much of this has been lost now because the ocean level is rising at a pretty good rate. There were other figures there. I think I saw a picture, and the water level is currently like right there. These are about to go, and others probably have. This is hundreds of feet back from the shore. And this cave, at the time where this datable rock art was happening, this cave was inland, some miles and up a little bit from the coast of the time. And of course, there's finds off of Egypt itself. These are more relatively recent finds. I think this is probably close to Alexandria in the Mediterranean. But, obviously there's impacts from these ocean rises. This is a place that's under also about 100 feet of water. It was maybe 10,000 years ago that this was above water. This is off of Japan. And the jury's out on this. It looks to be man-made. Those angles, the precision of it, in some cases there's natural fracturing. But this is a lot of that. And you got to wonder when you see stuff like this, and you know that there was people living for thousands of years before this flood, and some level of civilization was happening, whether it was on the megalithic scale of Atlantis or not. You got to wonder. And this is a very evolving storyline. Like I say, I first heard about the pictographs in the year 2000. 7 years later, the first scientific paper came out. There's been efforts to disprove the comet hypothesis, and in some cases, the people that went out that were really, no, this is this catastrophism, no, it's all gradual, they went out and they themselves in their digs found evidence, and they changed their belief system. So it's gaining more and more traction, and I would venture to say that this storyline will eventually rewrite our history. There's fossil records of kind of human-like figures for now 3 million years, and anatomically modern humans for at least 200,000 years, yet our continuous history kind of ends back there about 5,000 years ago. And you would think there would be some continuous history going back further unless something catastrophic happened. And we believe that is what happened at that point in time. So that's kind of the storyline I wanted to share with you and let you know that a lot of this is visible. If you go up into Washington, you can go to the scab lands and see evidence, obviously, super major erosion. And you just bear in mind, it's just one tract of the much more massive worldwide flood. The last picture comes from the Sahara Desert, and at a elevation that's not very high above the ocean. It is the Sahara. It's kind of a little south of Morocco. The ocean's out here. And it is believed, even though most of this is wind-swept sand, this is believed to be there too, from a flood that reached a certain level and then receded back. And during the Younger Dryas, as the temperatures plummeted, well, the ocean level, went up very rapidly, but then it started to freeze again. The glaciers formed again, and the sea level dropped down. And this may be indications, jury's out also on this, but this may be indications of how far-flung this flood was. North America was definitely more impacted than other parts of the world because it was closer to ground zero of the Comet strike. But the sea level rise changed the British Isles. They were now islands, they'd formerly be connected to France, like I mentioned earlier. And a lot of areas that were connected continuously became islands, such as Japan. So I'll leave you at that. And see if anybody might have any questions about that, any of those topics.
Thank you, Barry. That's great.
So Eric will entertain your questions now. Do you want them to raise their hands?
Oh, yeah, yes, yeah. If there's any questions. Nobody has a question, great. Yes.
There's some wave lines at Fort Rock on the.
Fort Rock, I'm familiar with it. It was not affected by this flood. However, back about 8,000, 10,000 years ago, there were these lakes. That's why it's called Lake County. And over time, it's dried up. But there were vast lakes, and there was a lake, I think it was stretched 40-some miles. And Fort Rock was a volcanic event as it came up underwater, and I believe it was ash. And normally ash could drift 1,000 miles. However, it came up in the water, and so it fell very close, damp as it was, to its base, and formed the ring, this kind of event. And then the lake water, little by little, kind of made those kind of lines there. Wave action, yes. Prevailing waves came in there. And it was formerly a full circle. And on the side where the prevailing winds came, it broke it away in time. But that's more like 7,000 to 10,000 years ago. And then the lake in time dried up.
Where about in Lake Michigan did they find those two rock formations?
It wasn't
Coastal.
far offshore,
Oh,
and I
what
think
city?
it was off of, I don't know the nearest city, but I reckon it was kind of between Milwaukee and Green Bay.
Oh, so it was closer
Wisconsin
to
side.
Wisconsin.
I believe so.
Okay. We
I
boated-
haven't dived
We
there, so I'm
boated
not
on
certain.
Lake Michigan for 15 years, and I wish I could have found something like that.
There's many more mammoth petroglyphs across the country,
Yeah,
but those aren't underwater now.
yeah.
They're still high and dry. Yes.
Those potholes, what was the source of water in those potholes? They're not.
Well, the flood's passing over it, and maybe the lay of the land is getting it to eddy and swirl around. So it's almost like a boring action of
the ones that are so full of water right now?
Yeah, the ones that have water in the.
well, it's groundwater or maybe snow melt, but no, there's no creek flowing into them. Yeah, there's thousands of them. Yes.
What
accounts for the extinction of the megafauna in Europe and Asia? Is it just the climate change after the comet?
Well, there's actually quite a bit of flood action going on in Europe too. I didn't show many photos, but there too. Just like the mammoths found in Corvallis, they're washed away. You know, they're drowned. And their habitat in Europe also is catching fire, and so they're losing habitat as well. But they estimate that about 50% of the human population perished at that time, and almost 99% of the megafauna. Of course, people are more adaptable and resourceful, and they were able to bounce back, obviously. The megafauna weren't. Yes. Yes.
Did they ever find any other fragments of the comet besides the one in the launch now? Might be.
Now, let me get that straight. They don't believe the Willamette meteorite was actually the event. It was a separate event, probably earlier in time. But you look at the moon and you see zillions of impact craters. And I think the moon, because it goes around the Earth, it gets most of the stuff that might hit us, fortunately. But it gives you an indication over time that there can be a lot of this type of stuff happening. They believe that the comet that wiped out the dinosaurs at 65 million years ago hit in the ocean. They have a crater underwater off of the Yucatan, and it's immense. So there it didn't hit the ice, it didn't vaporize, but they think that there was so much steam from hitting the ocean that is a big part of why the dinosaurs died. It just suddenly got really, really hot and steamy. It just like getting in a sauna that's 200 degrees. Yes.
So if you just go east of here a few minutes and look into the Crooked River Gorge, deep, wide, it looks to me like there's been times when there's a lot more water was flowing through there.
Well, that's a good point, and I thought somebody might mention it. Kind of looks like a coulee, but it isn't.
No.
It isn't a coulee. This is thought to be a double canyon, I think is what it's called. And so you would have had, way back in time, the Deschutes River cutting a canyon, and then the flow from Mount Newberry. And I'm thinking that's 3-5 million years ago about. It came off the north side of Mount Newberry, and it flowed liquidly, very rapidly, and it flowed 70-some miles from its source. It filled the Crooked River to the level we're on now. So it filled up the valley quite a bit from the millions of years of normal river erosion. And then over the millions of years, then the rivers continued to cut down through the second level.
Is that why this bench is here?
Yes.
Where we are right now?
We are on that
Okay.
Mount Newberry flow. And so much material came out of Newberry that the magma chamber that had held up the mountain about the size of Mount Hood, they think, it just collapsed in. It was the north flow, liquid flow across all this land, and it's very visible when you go to Bend. And you're on 97 and you look out at that big flat, this east of town. That's part of the flow. And it went all the way up here almost to Cove Palisades. 70-some miles. There's an enormous amount. It just totally transformed the land, hundreds of feet of this up, and then the mountaintop collapsed in. So this that's a super volcano, by the way. It's not on the same kind of north-south axis to most of the Cascades. It's actually tracked all the way east. It's the terminal west end of kind of a fissure that ends in Yellowstone. Yeah. It came up, a super major plume came up in Idaho, they think. And if you saw it cross-section, it'd be kind of like a candelabra. And there'd be an eruption go a little to the east along the crack, and a little to the west, and another one kind of to the east and the west, and it kind of kept moving out. And the terminal ends are currently Newberry on the west and Yellowstone on the east. Yep.
And that flowed over the Deschutes Formation, yet the Columbia stuff didn't get to here.
No, and I think, not that I know of.
Okay.
Now, there's a very distinct level that you get to when you get out of Madras. You need to climb up.
Yes, yes.
I think it's Cloverdale Way, climb
Yeah.
up, and then you have a vast flat. That's definitely those flows coming in kind of from the Blue Mountains, I believe, or kind of over by Idaho. Those flows that I showed the graph of. And then that continues all the way up, you know, to Moses Lake and towards Spokane Way and all that. So those is what I would identify as those flows
Columbia.
from one source. Yeah, Columbia Plateau flows. This other one that I'm describing is coming from another source entirely and more recent in time.
The Newberry one.
Yep.
You mean the one that's, what we're on, yeah, okay.
Yep.
On the same time frame, is there a meteor that hit the ice sheets over Greenland that also caused flooding as well?
Well, that's an interesting point. Through, I believe it's LIDAR, they were able to penetrate the existing ice sheet in Greenland, and they did locate a very big crater. And at the time, they didn't have access to it to, you know, kind of take these scientific lab readings of it, and there was some speculation that it could be from this particular comet. Now, of the last year or so, they feel it's much older event, not related to the big flood. Now, it probably caused havoc because it's huge, but it might have hit at a time when that was bare land at a glacial minimum way in the past, because there's no crater other than you could look at Hudson Bay maybe, or Saginaw Bay, but there's no definitive crater for this event that I was describing, and that's more a belief that it hit the ice sheet. By the way, it's believed that the ice sheet up there was 1 to 2 miles thick. Can you imagine? And so when it hit, it's blasting out giant pieces of ice flying 1,000 miles. You know, it's that big of an event. It's hard to comprehend. But the Greenland crater that I believe you might be mentioning that has made the news is thought to be a much older event, separate event. Yep.
What would be the mass of the comet, or rough size, or?
It's thought to be about a mile and a half in size. I think because of the ice cores, they feel that there's like a 20-year period of a series of these collisions that were going through that swarm time and again for about 20 years. And so they see a lot of the debris in the ice cores that would indicate multiple strikes. But they've done some computations, and they think there could be as much as 4 of the real big, a mile or so wide comets, asteroids that are actually striking the ice over a period of 20 years, maybe not the same moment in time. But one was big enough to create a big flood, no doubt about it. Any other questions, Sid?
The ice bays that you mentioned in Nebraska and
Yes.
Carolinas, those were from the chunks of ice flying out from the impact? Is that
That's the current belief.
okay?
It was once described some years ago that this impact, at least one of the impacts, was a lot like a shotgun blast. It kind of fans out, and that there's multiple hits, but we know also that there's explosions in the atmosphere. And so it may be that there's a combination of things. There could be things actually hitting in the shotgun blast kind of pattern, or more likely, the current belief is stuff blown out from the main hit that's flying 1,000 miles. And it goes out in both directions. If it's hitting here, it just goes out like that, lands. And it probably played a role in the fires starting in a bunch of places, too. Yep.
I didn't have a question, but I just wanted to say thank you so much for bringing this information to us.
Oh, sure.
I'm his daughter, so I get the information all the time. And
Bits and pieces.
Yeah.
Yeah, not in chronological order here.
I really appreciate you putting together the talk and.
Oh.
Yes.
All right. Well, I think you'll all find that we'll be hearing more about this hypothesis in time. There'll be more proof coming in, and it'll kind of depict what happened with, for sure, the Mega Fauna and probably the human race at that point in time. Thank you very much.